The crisis of the anti-COVID measures has a very particular effect in the USA and in Europe. It accelerates the socialist vision of the big Western countries. On one hand, the US is promoting a global floor for corporate taxes, coupled with an increase in taxes and the implementation of large public investments to boost growth. On the other hand, the European Union is dreaming of a global wealth tax, a carbon tax at the EU's borders, and, of course, large public investment plans to boost growth. If I were to poke fun at it, I would say that the West is being seduced by the socialist side of the force, while Asia is trying its best to develop a private economy. But then, what's the problem? Why can't the government become a strategic state in the service of protecting the welfare of the population? Come on, let's go. To understand this path between the need to organize together and this outcome that often leads us to the disempowerment of the individual over the government, we can tell the story by looking at the weight of public spending in the American GDP. Before the U.S. Constitution was written, before 1792, it was more like every man for himself and God for all. It is a world in which survival is hard. The private militia prevails over the public police. It's a bit like the atmosphere in the movie Gangs of New York. In this phase, we cannot speak of an economic fabric, but rather of a multiplication of private initiatives where each one imposes its law in the literal sense of the term. In the literal sense, we can say that it was the Wild West. The weight of the government is non-existent or barely measurable, since there is no government. The violence and insecurity of these times mean that few people really want to live in this world in the long term. One therefore calls for the creation of a public force, of a state in which one can use legitimate violence so that force is at the service of the collective interest. One then starts to write a constitution and laws whose objective is to define a framework of collective life favorable to the greatest number. We define what is acceptable and what is not on a moral basis. In the United States, the Americans start by declaring their independence from the European continent and creating a constitution to agree on what it means to be the United States of America. At this point, we can begin to see an economic fabric being built because the arrival of the government does a lot of good. Hope is born to have a space of safety in accordance with a will to live together. Culture, values, and morals are the unifying base. Well, this process is not a long, quiet river. Wars break out around the new power in place to challenge or overthrow it. A civilization can spend a lot of time crossing this stage, which sees political groups confronting each other without one or the other taking the upper hand. In the United States, this period ended with the end of the Civil War, which established the unity of the country by the defeat of the South in favor of the North under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. At this point, the state took a major step forward, and the economy was greatly strengthened because the nation-state had finally found a stable form in which to begin to acquire a real capacity to act. We move from the will to power to the acquisition of power. This is a very favorable context for the economy because the government is a very powerful factor of stability. The interesting thing about stability is that it allows you to project yourself into the future, and the future is the playground of entrepreneurs who are constantly trying to invent it. The second half of the 19th century was a period of very strong growth for the USA. The creation of major infrastructures, such as the railroad that would replace horseback transportation like the iconic Pony Express, an iconic mail transportation service, as couriers took turns to make sure your letter always galloped between St. Joseph and Sacramento. This is the whole story of the conquest of the West. During this period, the weight of the state increases from about 5% to 10%. For this, you have a minimal but existing security on the territory and a very basic administration. Basically, companies are starting to be able to project themselves, but the country is not exploiting its full growth potential. We still need more government to invent the public services that will be the basis of a strong and long-term growth. It is only in the 20th century, despite wars and serious economic and financial crises, that the United States has acquired health and education infrastructures as well as a financial and banking system worthy of a modern society. The weight of the state reaches 25% after World War II, and this is the beginning of the greatest phase of economic expansion in the United States of America. 25 to 35% of public spending in the GDP seems to be the optimum for a country. The government plays its role and fulfills its public missions, and the private sector is able to innovate and create because it relies on long-term infrastructures that ensure the human development of the country. Below 25% and too many people live in unhealthy conditions, and above 35%, the weight of the government begins to stifle the creation of value by the private sector. Moreover, on the graph of government spending in GDP, we can see that the end of the Bretton Woods agreements corresponds to a government weight that approaches 35%. In France, the country where taxation and the weight of the state is the highest in the world, the period of strong growth of the glorious 30s began after the war, with the weight of the state lower than 35%, and ended in the 1970s with the weight of the state higher than 45%. What is interesting is that in both cases, the US and France, budget deficits started to become commonplace for the same period, the 1970s. And this is not specific to the 1970s, since Switzerland, whose public spending now represents about 35% of GDP, has budget surpluses every year. But why? Here I am giving my ideas, but you will see it does not work completely. In this idea, the more the weight of the government increases, the more the freedom of the private sector decreases, and there seems to be an optimum between the constraint brought by the government, which is necessary up to a certain point, and individual freedom. It is a characteristic of the private sector to go bankrupt when it doesn't work. Bankruptcy is a Darwinian selection system that allows an economic fabric to progress rapidly. A company goes bankrupt within a few months or years when its model is no longer functional. Conversely, a government goes bankrupt, or at least undergoes a revolution, when its model is dysfunctional on the scale of several decades. So the government cannot be a driver of innovation, because it does not have the capacity to sort out what works and what does not. The state is there to define a norm, rules to give meaning to life in common. However, to say that companies are content to make money and the government to give meaning is reductive. Legally, we cannot ask a company to do anything other than make a profit in compliance with the law, because the government cannot invent the future. On the other hand, every normally constituted human being needs to give a meaning to what he does. This is why I personally believe in mission-based companies. These are companies that contextualize their economic activity to serve a mission. For example, Danone has given itself the following mission: bringing health through food to as many people as possible. As far as my company is concerned, the mission we have given ourselves is the following: to give people the knowledge and tools to safeguard their savings by increasing their financial freedom. In terms of economics, I am convinced that any business must ask the question of the meaning of what we do, because money is a good servant but a bad master. I think that this is why all governments are destined to become obese. In summary, at the beginning, the mission of the state is quite simple: to establish order and stability so that the economy can emerge within an acceptable framework. There are no rich countries without a strong, structured government. Otherwise, it is the law of the militia, of the private interest against the collective interest that prevails, and that does not work well at all. The role of the government is, above all, to protect each individual in his or her relations with others. This is why we talk about putting the use of legitimate violence in the hands of the government that defends the collective interest. On the other hand, once the government is in place, the population quickly comes to ask its political leaders to protect them against fate and destiny. The protective state becomes a nanny state, a state that stifles individual initiative. Then we come to ask the government to protect us against everything, and this can end in the extreme of abolishing individual rights in favor of everyone's rights. At this point, power has been concentrated in the hands of a small group of leaders and tyranny can begin. This tyranny ends with a revolution and we move on to something else. This is all well and good, but as I said, there is a hitch in my demonstration that I submit to you. The countries of Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in particular. They have quite enviable economic performances and rather healthy public finances, but the weight of the state is enormous, about 50%. This is an observation that goes against my analysis. So tell me in the comments what you think and I will continue to think about it. It seems that there is an additional hidden variable. However, that's what thinking is: to put forward hypotheses, ideas, and to marvel at the difficulties we encounter because the world is complex. The nice thing is that just by asking yourself questions regularly, you always learn a little more. On that note, see you soon for new videos.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the bell if you want to be notified of the next episode. And if you want to invest in the stock market over the long term or diversify your financial portfolio, I'm offering you an analysis of the 8 European star stocks to have. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.